It is on it, yeah. Okay, sorry. So I will be more cautious with this. So, the main task that I had was to take away that, may I use the word junk, and then come to the real material. The real material is very interesting and intriguing and was an eye-opener for me. My job tonight is to act as a facilitator. So I guess Katie has a plan that I will introduce the topic and I will highlight a few points related to this subject. This is a vast topic and there is no way that we can cover all of it and even touch the research that is going on in this field for the last 30 years or so. There's so much interest in science and neuroscience and psychiatry and neurology to find out what is happening with our brain while we are meditating, praying, or we are involved in different kind of religious and spiritual practices. So this is the right time to talk about it. And the platform, what I was saying is that this platform is so good because we all talked about tolerance and how we can live together. And neurotheology brings that platform to us. Science is fair to all of us, right? It doesn't discriminate. If you have an infection, the antibiotic will act similarly in a Muslim than in a Christian. I hope so, and Jewish and other religions too. If you come in the room and you turn on this switch, the light switch is not going to ask you about your gender or your religious preference or any of those identities. It will just turn on. So that's the beauty of science. Same as with the cars. I mean, anybody can drive. It doesn't matter which religion they belong to, or even if they have any religion or not. It doesn't matter, right? So that is what I learned, that science is actually helping us come together. And we will see how. And another surprise that was there is that it is actually the religion and the spiritual practices, all of them are actually neuroprotective. It actually helps us cope with the stress in a better way, and the science has proven that. So there are very significant changes in the brain that happen with true religious practices, not just attendance to the church, but actually meaning it. And believe it or not, these scientists and the researchers, they have the scales that they can measure who is faking religion and who is actually. I was surprised. So I will just move back and forth to move these slides. So just a disclaimer that I'm not a neuroscientist or neurologist or a neurosurgeon. I'm not a theologian, a philosopher or a scholar. I'm just a teacher. I practice psychiatry, run-of-the-mill kind of psychiatry. Every day I see patients, I teach. The only credential is that I volunteered to Katie, that I will talk about. That is what brings me here. Good. Oh, please, thank you. So with the next slide, well, this was my current, this was my understanding when I started reading about all this. And I don't know how many of you actually believe in this, that these are the two different pathways. Science is in this direction and religion is in this direction, and they have totally opposite point of views and they will never meet, or even if they meet, it's just for time being, and then they will have their own ways to go, right? But that is not the case, and that is what I'm going to present to you today. Thank you so much. Well, if we use the term spiritual, we may be able to bring these folks in, right? The spiritual means that getting in contact with your inner essence. That inner essence, and we will see by the end of this talk, is actually what makes us human. And through this connection with the inner essence, we ultimately connect with the higher power and with the other human beings around us. So it doesn't matter what is the practice. It doesn't matter which religion we belong to. As long as we have that basic ingredient in ourselves through which we can connect to our inner essence and other people and the higher power, we will have the effect of that practice on our brain in a positive way. Right? Okay. Thank you. All right. So, is this someone's idea of a joke? Well, the information is you are here, so that's not the idea. And that is what I want to explain, that neurotheology, neuroscience is not trying to reduce religion to nerve cells or neurotransmitters. That is not the idea. And that is what I thought initially. I said, okay, wow, so God is somewhere in the brain. No, not at all. The whole concept of neurotheology is, so far, is to study the effect of spiritual practices on the brain. That is neurotheology so far. To prove the existence of a God, or is God is a reality or a delusion, or what, all that is not the scope of neurotheology. Neurotheology is not talking about that. It may talk about the experiences which may be similar in psychiatry and religion in a way they are presented, like hearing voices, seeing visions, delusions and things like that, but no one is, everyone is sensible enough to know the difference. So that is not the debate that, okay, there is an overlap. Well, what it tells us that whatever is happening religious to us, it is not happening in our kidneys or in our spleen or in our liver, it is happening in our brain. And that is it. And then we can actually study that. Whether it is joy, emotion, awe, or any kind of ecstasy or feeling good, whether it is the normal interaction in the daily life or it is with a religious overtone, it's the brain that we have is functioning. The perspective may be different, the perception may be different, but the pathways are the same. And that is what the scientists are beginning to believe. All right, so religion. Religion is not only meditation and prayer. We all know that, right? It's a very complex, it's a very complicated, and it's a very integrative and encompassing, binding social reality, which is based on common faith values and a belief system. And this is from John Hart, who is a leading scholar and neuroscientist at George Washington University, and he's the one who wrote several books, and I'm very fond of his writing too. So that is where the religion stands as far as the definition is. So today I'm going to talk about 4 points. One is that the science is very inclusive. It does not discriminate. The second thing is that there is a definite change in the brain with a multitude of researches that have already been done, and there is a cortical thickening, meaning that certain areas of the brain actually increase in mass and volume with our religious practices. And then this hot topic, is there a God gene in our brain or in our body or in our DNA? Or is there a God spot? And are we born with that God spot and then we are religious? And if we don't have it, then we are doomed. And then finally, the empathy center. And I think this is the take-home message. If there is anything in this talk which is going to bring us together, is this fact that there is actually a center in the brain that is called empathy center. Alright, so we talked about brain. So this is our brain, and we are blessed with the biggest brain in this world in relation to the body size. We are really blessed as human beings that we have the biggest brain. It is about 1.5 kilograms in our body. And the main thing about the good thing is that we have actually developed a lot of brain over the years, and this whole thing which we call cortex, and Dr. Salim is the anatomy professor, so so we have two of these, right? We have two frontal lobes, we have two parietal lobes, two temporal and two occipital lobes. And this cortex, or this layer that has developed and evolved through years and years, that's the scientist's view, and we are blessed with that, is actually the 85% of our brain. And this is, oh, I can do it. I can do it from here. Okay, thank you. Happening, magic. Okay. So, some of this we know, and a lot of this we don't know. So, a lot of this is actually the association areas, processing areas, where the information is coming and making sense to us. Each lobe has a different function. We know that motor activity happens here, and so is the thinking and critical thought processing and decision making and abstract thinking and all of that. So this frontal lobe is very, very important. The parietal lobe gives us the pain and the sensation and the five senses and the spatial processing that we are in this space, and this is the surrounding and all that. I'm giving a very basic and brief outline. Of course, it does way more than that. The temporal lobe is very important to the religious understanding and our emotional well-being, because that is where the limbic system lies, and it connects with all parts of the brain to bring the emotions into a check. And we are able to process that in the right way. And so is the auditory processing and the sound. Everything is processed in these temporal lobes. And of course, the occipital is the visual processing center of the brain. And we are learning so much about this brain, that what exactly happens. And you know why this is happening in the last 30 years or so more in relation to religion? Because of availability of functional MRIs and PET scans and SPECT. Well, you cannot dissect an animal and see what is happening in terms of the religion or abstract thinking, because they don't have the cortex like we have, right? So they don't have the religious thought process to begin with. So with lab animals, we cannot do, or we couldn't do any experiments to find out what's happening in the brain. But these functional MRIs and PET scans have revolutionized the whole science, because now what you're thinking, we can actually see which area is lighting up. So this is so neat. All right, I think we already talked about that, and we already talked about that. So now let's talk about that cortical thickening that I was talking about. Lisa Miller is a leading investigator at Columbia University, and she published in her initial research in 2005 and 2006, and she showed through the MRIs. Her research is actually 30 years long, and she has included 3 generations. So G1 are the grandparents, and G2 are the parents, and G3 are the grandkids, right? So it's a 30-year-long research, and which is considered the hallmark and the main research in this field of effect of religion on the brain. What she found out initially was that so the G1, the actual cohort, the grandparents, were patients with depression and anxiety, right? So their kids were high-risk kids. So she found out that those high-risk kids, or G2, they had 30% thinning of their cortex and special area of the cortex that we will talk about. And that was on the lateral surface of the right hemisphere and mesial, which is the medial wall of the left hemisphere. So we don't want to go into the details of that. That can get really complicated. But this finding that there was a 30% thinning of the cortex at certain areas of the brain was very important finding in children of high risk, children of actually patients who were suffering from depression. So these children were high risk, right? And then she repeated these MRIs every 5 years, not only to that generation, but the generation after that. So this whole study was about 30 years long. So the recent study that was published was in 2014. And that showed a very remarkable thing, that among those high-risk middle generation who were supposed to get depression and they had the thinning of the cortex, the ones who engaged in religious practices and spiritual practices, that thinning was reversed. And they actually developed the thickening of that area. And that thickening of that particular area actually translates into resilience, into coping skills, into handling of the stress, and dealing with the day-to-day problems, and coming up with a better solution when you're stuck in a difficult position, right? So, the effects of importance on cortical thickness were significantly stronger in the high risk than in the low risk. A thicker cortex associated with the high importance of religion or spirituality may confer resilience to the development of depressive illness in individuals with high familial risk of major depression. I think this is great. This is a great news for all of us who are believers and who are into practice of religion or some spiritual activity, because it is actually doing something measurable in our brain, and it is protective. So all what we do is actually neuroprotective in nature. And these are the other studies which are actually showing the same thing and confirming the finding that Dr. Miller found out. Alright, so this is another view of the brain, and so this prefrontal cortex, this and this anterior cingulate gyrus and the insula, this also shows significant changes with the spiritual practices that we will see. So all this what means is that sensory and spatial processing is better, sense of self, reflective self-awareness, and navigation in space and spatial orientation. Alright, so I try not to be too technical, and I hope I'm not. If I am, just raise your hand and say, well, go back, and I will do that. So the next topic I wanted to clarify is about God gene. What is it? What is the discussion in science about it? And is it true or is it bogus? Well, if Dean Hammer is talking about something, it cannot be bogus. right? We need to pay attention to him because he is the director of gene structure and regulation unit at US National Cancer Center. And he wrote a book, and the book is The God Gene. So if we want to read a couple of books on this topic, this may be a good start, because that is where every discussion started in 2005 about God gene, how faith is hardwired into our gene. So what he's talking about is this thing, this VMAT2. What is VMAT2? This is a vesicular monoamine transporter. What does that mean? You know that the nerve cells connect with each other and there is a synapse in between, right? So there's a presynaptic neuron and there's a postsynaptic neuron. So the presynaptic neuron releases the neurotransmitters. And these neurotransmitters are serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine. And we talk about serotonin and norepinephrine all the time because that is what we prescribe to treat depression and anxiety. Right? These neurotransmitters cannot be released until they are packaged. So the package is called a vesicle. That vesicle is a membranous structure in which that neurotransmitter is packaged. It attaches with the cell membrane and then it releases into this space, right? So what he found out is that this neurotransmitter transporter, that is a protein, nothing more than that, which helps the neurotransmitters get packaged so that they can be released, is active with religious practices. Right? So after this, the huge discussion started. How could you call this process a God gene? I mean, there were a lot of people. This is his book that he wrote. So if you are interested, I actually made copies of all of my slides so that you don't have to write it down. So this is what I just talked about. And this protein is made by a particular gene on our DNA, and that's the number. So there were pros and for and against. The debate started, right? So one of the vocal voices is P.Z. Meyer, and he argues it's a pump, a teeny tiny pump, responsible for packaging a neurotransmitter, how that can be a gene. And then they found out that in people who are high functioning, altruistic, those who take care of other people, those who are like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi or big names, or even the community people who are involved in social services and they are compassionate and they are volunteering and they are actually important people and their brain functions in a different way at a higher level, this pump is very active in them too. So this is a transcendental kind of thing in the brain that happens that actually helps us move from the selfish life that we have to the more altruistic life that we actually take care of other people. So it is not just the religious or the spiritual practices, but anywhere where we are acting at a higher level than the normal human being, this pump is going to be more active and will actually serve us, protect us from depression and anxiety. Interesting, isn't it? And the theologian also said, well, this is not the right way to put things. We cannot put religion reduced into a gene. We cannot say that. And as we know that religion is way more than that. It's more complex, it's more comprehensive, it's a social reality, it is a binding thing, it is a value system, it's a faith and belief and a lot of other things. So it cannot be reduced into a gene. So that was the argument against this research. Then the second thing is that is there a God spot? So we know the difference between the gene, right? Gene is actually going to make the God spot. So then we say, okay then, gene is not there, gene is very universal and it is doing a lot of other things, but is there a God spot? Are we born with the God spot? Are we born religious? Or are we born non-religious? So there was a lot of research done on this topic as well, and the overwhelming consensus is that there is not one single area of the brain that can be responsible for our religious behavior. The whole brain works in unison and as a whole to create and contribute in this propagation of spiritualistic feeling, thoughts, abstract foundation. And what happens is that the science has told us and is continually telling us that it is like a kindling phenomenon. What happens with religious experiences is that if in temporal lobe, which is responsible for hearing, right, to be simply trying to simply put it, if we hear some voice and no one is there, unless it is a psychiatric condition, and we know that there are a lot of other associated symptoms and signs with it, but if it is a religious experience. If it is a religious experience, then it is not just processed in the temporal lobe, it goes to the parietal lobe, it goes to the frontal lobe, it goes to the different areas of the frontal lobe, and maybe also to the occipital lobe, and then the brain makes sense out of all of this information that has been given to it. And then whatever the inference is, whatever comes out of that, that is how the religious experience is perceived. It's very different than just putting a finger on one point and one part of the brain. So that is not true. And, well, the people are always on the both sides of the aisle, so people said, no, this is not true. And in 2008, there was a big debate, and René Muller took part in that. Neurotheologians also believe, and some of them actually became neuroscientists just to prove this reality. And some of them are very, very renowned, and one of them is Ron Joseph. And he goes a step further, and he says that there is not only God neurons making the God spot, but there are actually neurotransmitters which are responsible for the religious experiences. Well, it is not proved. So when we talk about limbic system, that's what he's talking about, right? So it's a very complicated structure in our brain that regulates our emotions, and that is where most of the experiences are processed, and not just the emotions, but the memory and the fear and a lot of other things which are associated with that overall experience. But this by itself cannot do much, because most of the information from the limbic system goes to frontal lobe and then comes back. So they all actually talk to each other, and that is when we come up with one decision. It's more complicated than that. Now, that is where I end. And what is going to happen is that after I finish this talk, we will post a question on the screen, and we would like you to divide into 3, 4, or 5 subgroups, and we would like you to discuss what that question means to you. And one of the group members among you will represent that group and will come and share that experience, because I would like to learn as much as you want to learn. So that will be very interesting exercise once we finish this. So empathy. Well, we all know what empathy is, right? It is not sympathy, right? Empathy is when we can feel other person's pain from that person's perspective. Isn't that interesting? And believe it or not, some people don't have And those who don't have it, they are not religious people. And science has proven that this one characteristic of humankind is extremely important and is the basic ingredient for us to be spiritual, for us to be able to feel other person's pain, and to be able to do something